Imagine waking up to the sound of explosions outside your window. Not in a war zone you expected. Not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, not even in Iran. You are in Riyadh. You are in Dubai. You are in Kuwait City. You are in Doha. Cities that were, until 72 hours ago, considered the most stable, the most prosperous, the most insulated places on the planet. And now, missiles are screaming across your skyline. Drones are slamming into buildings next to five-star hotels. Airports are closed. Stock markets are in free fall. And somewhere in the background, a phone is ringing inside the White House, and nobody is picking up. This is not a drill. This is not a movie. This is the Middle East on March 5th, 2026. And if you think you understand how we got here, I promise you, you do not. Because the real story, the story that the mainstream media is barely whispering about, is not just about Iran striking back at America. It is not just about Israel destroying nuclear facilities. The real story is about a betrayal. A cold, calculated geopolitical betrayal that the United States committed against one of its oldest and most powerful allies in the Middle East. And the victim of that betrayal is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how that happened, why it happened, and what it means for every single person on this planet. Because this conflict has now crossed a threshold that will reshape the global economy, the global energy market, and the global balance of power for decades to come. Stay with me. Because what happens in the next 15 minutes of this video, and what happened in the last 5 days in the real world, will change how you see everything. But first, I need to take you back. Not weeks, not months. I need to take you back to a moment that most people completely missed, because while the world was distracted by ceasefire negotiations and peace talks, a very different plan was being drawn up in the war rooms of Tel Aviv and Washington, D.C. A plan that had nothing to do with peace, and everything to do with securing a border that most people do not even think about when they talk about Israel. Israel's northern border, the one that faces Syria, the one that for decades has been a thorn in Israel's side, a corridor for Iranian weapons, a highway for Hezbollah, and a staging ground for the next existential threat against the Jewish state. That border was the reason. That border was the obsession. And it was that border that quietly, methodically, led the United States to make a decision that left Saudi Arabia, a country hosting American troops, American embassies, American intelligence infrastructure, completely and utterly exposed. Let us start at the very beginning of this chain reaction, because to understand the betrayal, you first have to understand the strategy. For the last 3 years, Israel has been doing something that almost no country in modern history has attempted. It has been systematically and deliberately dismantling what strategists call the axis of resistance. That is the network of Iran-backed proxy forces that surrounds Israel on multiple fronts. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the IRGC in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and Iran's ballistic missile program at its core. By early 2026, the results of that campaign were staggering. Hamas had been severely degraded. Hezbollah had been devastated by Israeli strikes throughout 2024. Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's iconic leader, had been eliminated. And perhaps most importantly for the northern border story, the Assad regime in Syria, Iran's most crucial land bridge into Lebanon, had collapsed. A new Syrian government was in place, and for the first time in 4 decades, Israel had a genuine, historic opportunity to neutralize the threat on its northern frontier. But here is where the situation becomes complicated. Because the new Syrian government was fragile, it was attempting to unify dozens of armed factions under a single military. It was still fighting ISIS remnants. It was navigating an incredibly delicate relationship with Turkey, the Kurds, Saudi Arabia, and the United States simultaneously. And right in the middle of all this political fragility, Israel had moved military forces into Syrian territory, into the buffer zone, into the Golan Heights area, into positions that gave it tactical dominance over southern Syria. Israel was not going to move those forces back without a guarantee, and the guarantee Israel wanted was simple. Iran must never be allowed to reconstitute its military presence in Syria. Not now, not ever. And the only way to guarantee that with absolute certainty was to destroy Iran's ability to project military power. Period. Now here is where the United States enters the picture. And here is where the calculation that would ultimately betray Saudi Arabia was made. America had been engaged in indirect nuclear talks with Iran throughout late 2020 and into February 2026. Those talks were being mediated by Oman. They were being described, even by optimistic observers, as a genuine possibility for peace. Oman's foreign minister himself said that peace was within reach, and Iran had apparently agreed to never, ever stockpile nuclear material for weapons. That was a massive concession, a historic one. And yet, despite this, despite the active diplomacy, despite the talks, President Trump announced he was not thrilled with the negotiations. And then, on February 28th, 2026, everything changed. That morning, before dawn, the skies above Tehran lit up, not with fireworks, with the most sophisticated and concentrated military strike package in the history of the Middle East. Operation Epic Fury, a joint U.S.-Israeli military operation targeting the leadership infrastructure, the nuclear program, the missile production facilities, and the command and control apparatus of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Within the first hours of the operation, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed when his compound was destroyed. Multiple senior military officials were eliminated. The Natanz nuclear facility was struck. Cities across Iran, Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, Kermanshah, were under simultaneous bombardment. Around 2,000 strikes were conducted in the first 3 days alone. Now pause. Breathe. Think about what I just said. This was not a targeted assassination. This was not a limited military strike. This was a regime change operation. The stated goal, confirmed by officials from both Washington and Tel Aviv, was to end the Islamic Republic as a governing institution, to eliminate Iran's nuclear capability, to neutralize its ballistic missile program, and critically, to permanently secure Israel's strategic environment, including, you guessed it, that northern border with Syria, where Iran had spent billions of dollars over decades building its presence. The operation worked, at least in its opening phase. Iran's military leadership was decapitated. Its air defense systems were systematically suppressed. Its nuclear program was, according to U.S. officials, severely damaged. And Israel was, for the first time in years, breathing easier about its northern flank, because with Iran's power significantly diminished, the threat of reconstitution in Syria became manageable. But here's the thing about military operations, and here's the brutal truth about what the Americans and Israelis knew when they launched this attack. They knew Iran would retaliate. Of course they did. Any first-year military strategist knows this. You assassinate a country's supreme leader. You bomb its capital city. You strike its nuclear facilities. And you expect that country to sit quietly? No. Iran was always going to retaliate. The question was where. The question was how. And here is what makes the betrayal of Saudi Arabia so extraordinary and so damning. The United States knew that Iran's retaliation would fall, at least partially, on the Gulf states, because that is where American military bases are. That is where American infrastructure is. That is where Iran would logically aim its missiles and drones to hurt U.S. military power without striking the American homeland directly. And the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, they knew this too. In fact, in the weeks before the strike, these Gulf states had been actively lobbying the Trump administration not to launch military action. Think about that. America's own regional allies were begging Washington not to do this. Saudi Arabia, which has one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the Arab world, understood exactly what an attack on Iran would trigger. The UAE understood it. Qatar understood it. Oman, which had been the mediating channel for the nuclear talks, was so committed to diplomacy that its foreign minister was declaring optimism even on the final day of negotiations. These nations did not want this war. They had everything to lose and almost nothing to gain from it. And the Trump administration knew all of this. The diplomatic warnings were loud. But they went ahead anyway. And when they did, when the first U.S.-Israeli bombs fell on Tehran on February 28, 2026, the Gulf states were not warned with sufficient advance notice to fully prepare their civilian populations. They were not given the operational details they would have needed to position their own military assets optimally. They were told, essentially, that America was doing this, and they would have to manage the consequences. That is the betrayal. Not a dramatic public betrayal, not a speech or a policy announcement, a quiet, cold-blooded, strategic betrayal, where the safety of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain was sacrificed on the altar of Israel's long-term security objectives. Now, let me be precise about what happened next, because this is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Iran's response was not what most analysts expected. Most analysts, even those who anticipated retaliation, expected Iran to do what it had done before: fire a calibrated salvo, make a symbolic point, and then signal that it was satisfied. That is what Iran did after Qasem Soleimani was killed in 2020. That is what Iran did after the first U.S.-Israeli joint strikes in June 2025. Limited, contained, almost theatrical retaliation. But not this time. This time was different. Because this time, Iran's supreme leader was dead. Its military command structure was partially shattered. And a wounded, cornered Iran, in its final institutional hours, unleashed everything it had. Dozens of ballistic missiles and drones were launched simultaneously at targets across the entire Middle East. Israel was struck. Jordan was struck. Iraq was struck. And then came the moment that made the Gulf states realize the full magnitude of what Washington had done to them. Kuwait was struck, Bahrain was struck, Qatar was struck, the UAE was struck, and Saudi Arabia was struck. Iran's missiles and drones targeted U.S. military bases in all of these countries. But here's the thing about missiles and drones. They do not have surgical precision in every case. Debris falls, and Iranian Shahed drones, cheap, effective, and numerous, do not always discriminate between a U.S. military base and the residential neighborhood next to it. In Bahrain, the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet was targeted. Footage circulated globally showing a drone smashing into a tower block near the fleet's headquarters, setting it ablaze. Residential buildings in Manama were hit. In Kuwait, ballistic missiles rained down on Ali Al Salem Air Base. A drone struck Kuwait International Airport, injuring airport employees and damaging the passenger terminal. In Qatar, explosions rocked Doha. The Qatari Prime Minister himself made an emergency phone call to Iran's foreign minister to demand an end to the attacks. In Dubai, missiles, or debris from intercepted missiles, struck the legendary Palm Islands area. A fire broke out near a hotel on the Palm Jumeirah, one of the most iconic luxury tourism destinations on the planet, with thick plumes of black smoke rising into the Gulf sky. The U.S. Embassy issued emergency shelter-in-place warnings to American citizens. The CIA station in Saudi Arabia was hit. Let that sink in for a moment. Saudi Arabia's eastern region, the heart of the kingdom's oil infrastructure, was struck. And what was America's response to its ally being bombed? The United States closed its embassies in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Lebanon. It ordered non-emergency government personnel to evacuate the region. It facilitated charter flights out of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan to help American civilians escape. America was running. It was, in the most literal sense, leaving Saudi Arabia to deal with the consequences of a war it never wanted and was never consulted on as an equal partner. Now, I promised you earlier that I would get to the Strait of Hormuz, and here we are. Because if the drone attacks on Riyadh and the fire on Palm Jumeirah were dramatic, what Iran did with the Strait of Hormuz was in a different category entirely. This was the move that could genuinely restructure the global economy, and the world stopped breathing. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the Arabian Sea and the rest of the world. Through that narrow choke point passes approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply. 20%. That includes oil from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, and Iran itself. When ships in the Gulf began receiving messages about the Strait's closure from the UK Maritime Trade Operations Agency, the reaction in global commodity markets was immediate and violent. The price of Brent crude oil, which had been trading around $70 per barrel before the conflict began, surged past $80 within days. And analysts were warning this was just the beginning. If the Strait closure held for weeks rather than days, if Iran maintained its blockade with mines, naval vessels, and anti-ship missile batteries, the price of oil could reach levels not seen since the worst energy crises of the 20th century. Think about what that means. Think about who gets hurt, not just oil companies. Every business that requires transportation, every cargo ship in the Indian Ocean rerouting around Africa, adding weeks and tens of millions of dollars to shipping costs. Every consumer in Europe, Asia, America, who fills up their car, buys food that was shipped across the ocean, every one of them was about to feel this war in their wallet. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 400 points in a single session. Asian markets opened red across the board. European markets followed. Economists who had been cautiously optimistic about global growth projections for 2026 were suddenly revising those projections dramatically downward. The words inflationary spiral and global recession began appearing in financial briefings and central bank communications. And the Gulf states, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, whose entire economic models are built on the premise of stability, security, and being the financial and logistical hubs of a connected world, began hemorrhaging money at a rate that was difficult to even calculate. Dubai, which had spent decades branding itself as the world's most reliable, most glamorous, most open city for business and tourism, suddenly had its airports closed and fires on its Palm Islands. Emirates Airlines, one of the world's largest and most profitable carriers, was grounding flights. The Dubai International Financial Center was watching clients make panicked calls. Abu Dhabi, which manages one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, was watching its carefully cultivated global image of invincibility crack in real time, with nearly 60 injured, as Iranian missiles, or the debris of intercepted missiles, fell on one of the richest cities on Earth. And through all of this chaos and economic catastrophe and the obliteration of the Gulf's carefully cultivated image of stability, the Gulf states were discovering a truth that Saudi Arabia had suspected for years. In Washington's strategic calculus, they were instruments of American policy, not partners of it. They were useful when they hosted American bases, useful when they kept oil flowing, useful when they normalized relations with Israel, useful when they funded American policy objectives. But when the bill came due, When the decision was made to launch the most consequential military operation in the modern Middle East, the Gulf states were not at the table. They were on the menu. And now I want to zoom out, because I promised you I would connect this to Israel's northern border. And I want you to see the full picture, the strategic logic, and why, for all the horror of the short-term consequences, this may have been, from Israel's perspective, the most rational decision it has ever made. Even if it was, from Saudi Arabia's perspective, an unforgivable one. For decades, Israel has faced an existential dilemma on its northern frontier. Lebanon, with Hezbollah as a state within a state, armed with hundreds of thousands of rockets, funded by Iran, disciplined and lethal in a way that Hamas never was. Syria, under Assad, Israel had bombed that corridor hundreds of times. It had conducted thousands of airstrikes in Syria over the years, targeting weapons shipments, IRGC installations, Hezbollah command posts. But it could never fully close the corridor because the source, Iran, remained intact. Then, in late 2024, Assad fell. A new Syrian government came to power, one that was actively negotiating with Israel, one that wanted to demilitarize its relationship with Tehran, one that offered Israel, for the first time, the possibility of a northern border that was not a permanent war front. But that possibility was fragile. It depended on Iran being unable to reconstitute its influence in the new Syria. And Israel knew, from its own intelligence and from watching Iran's behavior for 40 years, that a wounded but surviving Islamic Republic would eventually rebuild those relationships, would eventually find new pathways, would eventually rearm Hezbollah, would eventually restore what had been taken. There was only one permanent solution, and on February 28, 2026, Israel implemented it by eliminating Iran's supreme leader, by destroying its military command infrastructure, by striking its nuclear program and ballistic missile production. Israel was not just fighting a war. It was performing surgery. It was removing the cancerous tissue that had, in its strategic assessment, threatened its existence for 4 decades. The northern border, Lebanon, Syria, would now, over time, be manageable. Because the engine of the threat, the Islamic Republic in its current form, was being dismantled. Was this legal? The United Nations said no. Multiple countries condemned it as a violation of international law and Iranian sovereignty. Was it morally clean? Absolutely not. Civilians were killed. A school was struck. A hospital complex was damaged. The human cost in Iran was devastating. But from Israel's cold strategic perspective, from Netanyahu's perspective, this was the price of permanent security. And America paid part of that price by accepting that its Gulf allies would absorb Iranian retaliation on their soil. Now, Iran's foreign minister tried to navigate this impossible situation by making a critical distinction. He told the Gulf states, he told Qatar directly in that emergency phone call with the Qatari prime minister, that Iran was not attacking the Gulf countries themselves. It was attacking American military presence within those countries. We are not targeting our neighbors, Araghchi said. We are targeting the presence of the U.S. in these countries. It is a distinction that sounds almost reasonable until you realize that a missile striking near the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh does not check your passport before the explosion. It does not ask whether the person in the building next door is American or Saudi. And a drone hitting near the U.S. consulate in Dubai does not confine its fire to American property. The only Gulf state that Iran did not strike was Oman, and the reason tells you everything. Oman had been the diplomatic mediator. Oman had been the channel through which peace talks were conducted. Oman's foreign minister had been, until the very last moment, believing and publicly stating that peace was achievable. Iran, even in its most destructive retaliatory mode, preserved Oman, because Oman had played no part in the betrayal. Oman had tried to prevent the war, and that distinction, the moral distinction between the Gulf states that America used as military platforms, and the one state that tried to preserve dialogue, is one that the region will not forget for a generation. Now let us talk about something that is not getting nearly enough attention in the mainstream coverage of this conflict. Let us talk about the economic warfare dimension. Because while the missiles are dramatic, while the political fallout is historic, the truly lasting damage from this conflict may not be the physical destruction. It may be what happens to the architecture of the global economy in its aftermath. Iraq, which was also caught in Iran's retaliatory fire, announced that its southern oil fields near Basra were being forced to stop production and pumping. Why? Because of a shortage of tankers entering the Persian Gulf. With the Strait of Hormuz closed, tankers were simply not coming in, and with nowhere to put the oil, storage facilities were filling to critical levels, forcing producers to halt operations. Iraq pumps around 4 million barrels of oil per day. That production was being choked off not by bombs, but by logistics, by the simple, devastating consequence of a closed waterway. Qatar, which hosts the world's largest liquefied natural gas facility and is one of Europe's most important energy suppliers, saw its LNG shipments disrupted. This matters enormously for Europe. which has spent the last 3 years desperately trying to reduce its dependence on Russian energy by shifting to Qatari LNG. Now that supply line was under threat. European energy ministers were in emergency sessions. Germany, France, Italy, countries that had just stabilized their energy markets after the trauma of the Ukraine war, were watching their energy security unravel again from a completely different direction. Asian markets, particularly Japan, South Korea, and China, which are collectively the largest consumers of Gulf oil, were watching with barely concealed panic. Japan imports nearly 90% of its oil from the Middle East. South Korea's entire industrial economy runs on energy that transits the Strait of Hormuz. China, for all its strategic autonomy, depends on the Gulf for a substantial portion of its energy imports. All of them were recalculating. All of them were watching what was supposed to be a regional conflict suddenly threaten the foundations of their industrial economies. And the airline industry. Let us spend a moment on the airline industry because it is one of the most visible and immediate indicators of economic disruption. Bahrain, Iraq, Israel, Kuwait, Qatar, Syria, and the UAE all closed their airspace simultaneously. Thousands of flights were grounded. Major carriers, Emirates, Qatar Airways, Kuwait Airways, Air Arabia, were unable to operate. Flights from Europe to Asia, which routinely pass over Gulf airspace, were being forced into lengthy and expensive detours. Air India was rerouting. Singapore Airlines was rerouting. Korean Air was rerouting. Lufthansa was rerouting. Every reroute cost tens of thousands of dollars in additional fuel per flight, and the costs were being added up by accountants in real time, while passengers sat in airports in Rome, Frankfurt, London, and Mumbai, wondering if they would ever reach their destinations. The insurance industry was repricing war risk premiums for ships and aircraft at a speed that suggested systemic shock rather than normal market adjustment. Shipping companies were calling force majeure on contracts. Banks with significant Middle East exposure were marking down assets. The global financial system was absorbing a shock it had not stress tested for, because nobody in Washington, in London, in Frankfurt, in Singapore had genuinely modeled the scenario where the Gulf simultaneously became a war zone. And yet, even in the middle of all this economic carnage, there was something else happening, something that speaks to the deeper geopolitical transformation that this conflict represents. The U.S. Senate was moving to consider a resolution limiting President Trump's ability to continue military action in Iran without congressional approval. Democratic senators were emerging from classified briefings saying they had no idea what America's actual objective in this war was. The White House had given, as CNN reported, contradictory accounts of why the U.S. attacked Iran. Different officials offered different justifications on different days, preventing a nuclear weapon, responding to preemptive threats, responding to potential attacks. The UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, directly contradicted U.S. claims by stating that Iran was not, in fact, days or weeks away from having atomic weapons. The scientific and strategic basis for the war was being challenged from within the very institutions that America claims to respect. And Trump himself, in a moment of characteristic candor, said the war could last 4 to 5 weeks, but could go far longer. The markets heard that and sold off again. Investors who had hoped for a swift, contained conflict were beginning to price in the possibility of a protracted, grinding engagement that would keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, keep Gulf airspace restricted, keep energy markets in crisis, and keep the global economy in a state of suspended anxiety for months or longer. Now here is where I want to slow down and address something directly, because it is the question that every intelligent viewer of this story should be asking. Was America aware of what it was doing to Saudi Arabia? Was this negligence, or was this cold-blooded calculation? I believe, and the evidence strongly supports this, that it was calculation, not because American policymakers are villains, but because geopolitics, at the level of great power decision-making, is almost never about what is right. It is about what is strategically necessary. And the Trump administration made a calculation that the long-term strategic benefit of destroying Iran's military and nuclear capability, permanently securing Israel's northern border, permanently ending the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon, permanently dismantling the axis of resistance, outweighed the short-term cost of exposing Gulf allies to Iranian retaliation. Chatham House, one of Britain's most respected strategic think tanks, made a remarkable observation in its analysis of this conflict. It argued that Arab Gulf leaders themselves had, in the months before the attack, expressed the view that the greatest risks in the region were no longer just Iran, but an expansionist and aggressive Israel, and the chaos of a potentially collapsed Iranian state. Read that again. Gulf leaders were worried about Israel, not just Iran. They had spent years watching Israel conduct strikes across Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, watching a neighbor whose territorial ambitions, as expressed by its own ambassador to the United States just 2 weeks before the war, potentially extended from the Nile to the Euphrates. That kind of statement, made by U.S. Ambassador Huckabee to Tucker Carlson on national television, had generated an avalanche of criticism from Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And now, 2 weeks later, the U.S. and Israel had launched the biggest military operation in the region's modern history, without substantive consultation with those Arab allies. The UAE made a dramatic and symbolic move in response. It recalled its ambassador to Israel. Let that sink in. The UAE, one of the Abraham Accords signatories, one of the countries that had most visibly and publicly normalized relations with Israel in recent years, pulled its ambassador. That is not a routine diplomatic protest. That is a signal aimed directly at Washington and Tel Aviv, that the Gulf states have a limit, that there is a point beyond which the perception of being used, of being strategically sacrificed, becomes politically unsustainable even for governments that have long maintained warm ties with America. And the editors and analysts of the Gulf region were not mincing words. Faisal al-Mudaka, editor-in-chief of the Gulf Times in Doha, put it with remarkable bluntness. This is Israel and the U.S.'s war, and it has nothing to do with us. We are just stuck in this geopolitical location. A Gulf editor in a Gulf newspaper, saying publicly that his region was being made to suffer for someone else's war. This level of public frustration, this kind of statement from a mainstream Gulf media figure, reflects a fracture in the U.S.-Gulf relationship that will take years, perhaps a decade, to repair. Kataib Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Iraqi militia, had its own message for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and it was not diplomatic. The group warned the two countries, explicitly and publicly, to adjust their statements according to their true size, accusing them of putting their territories and capabilities in the service of the Zionist American project. This kind of rhetoric from Iran-aligned groups is a standard feature of regional conflict, but its specific targeting of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in this moment reflects the degree to which the Gulf states are now perceived by Iran's allies as complicit in what happened. It is a perception that carries real risk. Kataib Hezbollah and similar groups have shown repeatedly that they are willing to translate rhetorical threats into operational action. And then came the development that, in any previous era of modern history, would have been considered the most dramatic news event of the decade. The United States Navy sank an Iranian warship, not in the Persian Gulf, not in the Red Sea, off the coast of Sri Lanka, in the Indian Ocean. A U.S. submarine, operating in international waters thousands of miles from the main theater of conflict, intercepted and sank an Iranian vessel. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth confirmed it. Sri Lanka's navy was recovering bodies from the Indian Ocean, and for the first time in decades, a major power had sunk another state's warship in international waters outside the immediate conflict zone. This was, by any definition, a significant escalation, a demonstration that America was prepared to pursue this conflict far beyond the boundaries of the Middle East, into shipping lanes, into ocean corridors, into the global maritime domain. At almost exactly the same time, NATO made its presence felt in a way that nobody had anticipated. A Turkish air defense system, operating as part of NATO's integrated air defense network, shot down an Iranian missile that had been traveling toward Turkey's airspace. This was the first time in the entire conflict that NATO had directly intercepted an Iranian weapon. And it meant that the war had, in the most technical sense, touched a NATO member state. Article 5, the collective defense clause that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all, had not been invoked. But the fact that Turkish and NATO systems were now actively shooting down Iranian ordnance raised questions that European defense ministers were scrambling to answer. Greece and France were already sending frigates, fighter jets, and air defense systems to Cyprus after British bases on the island, the Akrotiri and Dhekelia military sites, had been struck by Iranian drones. Let me pause here and reflect on something that I think often gets lost in the breathless, moment-by-moment coverage of events like this. We are witnessing a genuine historical inflection point. And inflection points, by their very nature, feel different from the inside than they look in retrospect. From the inside, they feel chaotic, confusing, terrifying, and impossible to interpret. From the outside, looking back years later, they look like the obvious beginning of a new era. What we are watching right now, in March 2026, is the collapse of the post-Cold War Middle Eastern order. The order that was built on American primacy, on the premise that America would protect its Gulf allies, on the premise that Iran could be contained through sanctions and diplomacy, on the premise that Israel could achieve security through military deterrence without triggering a regional conflagration. All of those premises are being tested simultaneously, and several of them are failing. The death toll in Iran was passing 1,000 people, according to the US-based human rights activists' news agency. These were not just military personnel. They included civilians, children, people who lived near the buildings that were struck. And while American and Israeli officials insisted that their targeting was precise, that they were targeting military and governmental infrastructure rather than civilians, the reality of urban warfare, even from the air, is that precision has limits. A double-tap strike on Tehran's Nilufar Square killed more than 20 civilians. A school was hit. Hospitals were struck, including the Khatam al-Anbiya and Gandhi hospitals, in a targeting decision that drew immediate condemnation from international medical organizations. Cities became ghost towns as terrified civilians stayed inside, unable to go to work, unable to access food and medicine, unable to understand when or whether the bombs would stop. And the Gulf states heard that message. They heard it in Riyadh, where drones attacked near the American embassy on their soil. They heard it in Dubai, where fires burned near the Palm Jumeirah. They heard it in Doha, where the Qatari prime minister was calling Iran to beg for a ceasefire while Iranian missiles were still in the air. They heard it in Kuwait, where the airport was being hit and the air defense systems were working around the clock to intercept ballistic missiles. They heard it in Manama, where the Bahrain Cybercrime Directorate was arresting its own citizens for sharing content about the attacks on social media, because the government was so terrified of public unrest that it was prioritizing information control over everything else. These governments are not weak, they are not helpless, but they are furious. And in the long game of geopolitics, fury from your allies tends to have consequences that outlast any single military victory. Here is the deeper question. Here's the question that matters, not just for today, not just for this week, but for the years and decades ahead. What does the post-conflict Middle East look like? Even if Operation Epic Fury achieves its stated objectives, even if the Islamic Republic undergoes the kind of transformation or collapse that American and Israeli policymakers hope for, what is left behind? Chatham House raised this concern directly. It argued that a weakened Iran would allow greater Chinese influence in the region. China, which has spent years quietly building economic relationships throughout the Middle East, the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Iran Comprehensive Cooperation Agreement, the infrastructure investments across the Gulf, was watching this conflict with the long-term perspective that is China's greatest strategic advantage. While America was making decisions on a political cycle measured in years, China was making decisions on a strategic horizon measured in decades. In a destabilized post-conflict Middle East, with Gulf states disillusioned by American reliability, with Iran in turmoil, with oil markets in chaos, and with the global energy architecture under stress, that is, paradoxically, an environment in which China's patient, non-military approach to influence might flourish. Russia, equally, was watching with interest. Russia, which has its own complicated relationships with Iran, with Syria's new government, with Turkey, Russia understood that every degree of American overextension in the Middle East was potentially a degree of relief on its western flank in Ukraine. The world's crises do not exist in isolation. They are connected by the finite resource of great power attention and military capability. And when America commits itself to a major military operation in the Middle East, it is simultaneously reducing its bandwidth for every other theater. This is the world that Saudi Arabia now inhabits, a world where its most powerful protector has demonstrated that it is willing to expose Saudi territory to missile attack in the pursuit of objectives that Saudi Arabia was not fully party to. A world where Iran, even a damaged Iran, even a partially decapitated Iran, has proven that it retains the capability and the will to strike deep into the Gulf. A world where the economic model that Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 is built upon, diversification away from oil, attracting foreign investment, building tourism and technology sectors, depends entirely on a stability that has now been shattered, at least temporarily, in the most dramatic possible fashion. And yet, for all the anger, for all the betrayal, for all the economic damage, Saudi Arabia has not cut ties with the United States. It has not expelled American troops. It has not pivoted to China or Russia in a dramatic public way, because Saudi Arabia, for all its frustration, understands the same brutal reality that every major power in the region understands. In a world where Iran has been partially degraded and its proxies significantly weakened, in a world where the axis of resistance has been substantially dismantled, Saudi Arabia's own long-term security environment may actually improve, not because of anything Saudi Arabia chose, not because of anything it consented to, but because the war that it was excluded from, the war it warned against, the war it suffered from, may have produced, as a side effect, a strategic environment that is ultimately less threatening to Riyadh as interests than the one that existed before February 28, 2026. That is the terrible irony at the heart of this entire story. Saudi Arabia was betrayed. Saudi Arabia paid a price, and Saudi Arabia may ultimately benefit from the outcome of a war it never wanted. That is not justice. That is not partnership. That is geopolitics. Raw, cold, amoral, brutal geopolitics operating at the highest level of strategic calculation. And understanding that distinction between justice and strategic reality is essential if you want to understand not just what happened last week, but what is going to happen in the months and years ahead. Because this conflict is not over. Trump said it himself, 4 to 5 weeks at minimum, possibly far longer. Iran's missile capacity has been significantly degraded, down 86% in volume from the first day of the war, but Iran is not yet a defeated state. A successor to Khamenei has not yet been named. Iran's internal political situation is genuinely chaotic, with the revolutionary institutions in crisis, with street protests that had been building since early 2026, now evolving in unpredictable directions as the external war adds new pressures to the internal social contract. Hezbollah in Lebanon has entered the conflict, launching strikes against Israel in retaliation for Khamenei's killing, which the IDF has described as an official declaration of war by Hezbollah, vowing to neutralize the threat. The northern front that Israel fought so hard to stabilize is now being activated from the Lebanese side. The Strait of Hormuz remains at this moment officially closed. Vessels in the Gulf are avoiding movement. Oil markets are repricing daily. Every day that the strait closure holds is a day that the global economy absorbs another body blow. And the question of whether the international community, whether the UN Security Council, whether major powers like China, Russia, and the EU can construct a framework that gives all parties an exit ramp is utterly unanswered. The U.S. Senate's efforts to invoke war powers limitations on Trump face an uncertain legislative path. The diplomatic channels that existed before the war, Oman's mediation, the Geneva talks, are essentially inoperative in the current environment. Iran's foreign minister is writing to the UN Secretary General. The UN Secretary General is calling for restraint, and meanwhile, bombs are falling and missiles are flying and the world is watching, and hoping that the next escalation is not the one that tips this from a regional catastrophe into something truly global. Because that is the question lurking at the edge of every analysis of this conflict. The W.W3 question. The question of thresholds and tripwires. The question of what happens if Iran, in its desperation, attempts to actually mine the Strait of Hormuz in a way that U.S. naval forces must physically clear. What happens if Iranian missiles kill a significant number of Saudi civilians, and Saudi Arabia is forced by domestic pressure to respond militarily? What happens if Hezbollah, fighting from Lebanon, triggers a full-scale ground invasion by Israel into Lebanese territory? What happens if one of Iran's missiles accidentally kills a significant number of Chinese nationals working at one of the Gulf ports or industrial facilities? What happens if Turkey, whose NATO air defense just intercepted an Iranian missile, finds itself politically unable to remain passive? These are not hypothetical science fiction scenarios. These are the logical next moves on a chessboard that has already moved far beyond anyone's original script. The world is, as I speak to you right now, holding its breath. Not because of ideology, not because of religion, not because of history, but because of oil, because of money. Because of the 20% of global energy supply that transits a 33-kilometer waterway, and because the people who control that waterway are currently at war. And the decisions being made in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Beijing, and in Moscow over the next 30 days will determine whether this conflict becomes the great defining catastrophe of our generation, or whether, through diplomacy, through strategic restraint, through the recognition by all parties that the alternative to peace is too horrific to contemplate, the world finds a way back from the brink. What you have just heard is not a partisan narrative. It is not pro-Iran or anti-Israel. It is not pro-America or anti-Saudi. It is the strategic reality as it exists, told without the comfortable sanitizing that makes it easier to watch but harder to understand. Saudi Arabia was exposed. The Gulf was targeted. The global economy is being squeezed. And Israel's northern border is, for the moment, more secure than it has been in 40 years. All of those things are simultaneously true. And sitting with that complexity, holding it without resolving it into a simple hero and villain story, is the most important thing you can do as a citizen of a world that is going to have to live with the consequences of these days for a very long time. Stay informed, watch closely, and understand that what you are witnessing is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of a new chapter in a story that is far from written, because the Middle East, as it has always done, will survive this. The question is what it will become on the other side.